So I first want to say welcome to our panel discussion on breaking through cultural barriers and seeking help for mental health and substance use challenges. We're so happy that you took the time out of your busy schedules, and I know they are busy, to join us today. My name is Amy Levine. I'm the Director of Programs and Volunteers here at LCL. And we're interested in developing innovative, relevant, and important programs with the goal of promoting well-being and resilience in the legal community. So hopefully you'll find this discussion to fit in with that description, and you'll provide us with some feedback. At the end, we send out a questionnaire. And for those of you who may not be aware of everything that LCL does, that we do, we provide free and confidential mental health resources, addiction recovery support, and practice management services to lawyers, law school students, judges, and their family members, as well as legal business professionals. And also a housekeeping tip for questions, please put those in the Q&A and we'll get to those at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator and panel. For their full bios, I encourage you to look at our website for those. And first up, our moderator, Dr. Charmaine Jackman, is the CEO and founder of InnoPsych, an award-winning licensed psychologist, speaker, writer, and consultant. She was also one of our gold sponsors this year for our Brink dinner, so a big thank you for that. That was wonderful. And I will introduce the panel. Mariette Clardy Davis is an assistant vice president and assistant GC at Primerica. Danya Fazbash, legal counsel, business and legal affairs at BBC Studios. Richard Hennessy, partner at Morrison Mahoney. Diana Lee, attorney at Eris Management. April Toy, partner at Hinshaw & Culbertson. Alan Wong, associate counsel at NFS Leasing. And David Zalia, assistant professor at Brown University. Thank you all for joining us today. And without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Dr. Jackman.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for coming and for engaging in this brave conversation. I often start off any conversation with a check-in. And so I will do this for this talk because I think it's extremely relevant. As Amy said, I am a psychologist and I started a company called InnoPsych. And our goal is to connect people, companies, and communities to inclusive mental health resources. I am going to share my screen and we can do present. Sorry, there we go.
Let me know if you need any assistance.
So you can scan the QR code here. Can you see that? Yes. And I can also put it in the chat. And you're just sharing a word that captures how you've been feeling over the past day or two, the past week. This allows us to check in and see how you're doing. And I'm going to share the link here in the chat as well. I see some responses coming in already. Give it a little bit more time. And let me present. Huh. So here we have about half of our folks in. We're saying hopeful, overwhelmed, growing, hopeful, tired, scared, concerned, working, anxious. Lots of important words for us to know and be in touch with how people are feeling. Please continue to share those words. I'll pause the screen for now. But this is helpful to know what people are dealing with or carrying as they come into this space. So as I mentioned, I am a psychologist, and so I enjoy having these conversations with folks because I think particularly when we're thinking about our communities, there's a lot of silence and stigma around these conversations. Most recently, my company, my team and I conducted some research that we've been collecting for probably about 2 years now. And we found some really fascinating data. And I'll share the link with it for you so you can see this data. But I wanted to just pull out a couple points because I think they're extremely relevant to our conversation. So the report is called How People of Color Think About Therapy. And I just want to share a couple of our findings. And I'll share a link, as I mentioned, to this data. I will have to say this is definitely a sample that were people who were engaged in therapy, right? So I think the people who filled out the form were more likely to have gone to therapy, as you can see from the data. So about 80% of people said that they met with a therapist before. What was not surprising, but it was good to have data because there's actually no data around some of these yet. Is it important for you to have a therapist who comes from a similar racial or ethnic background? And 88% of people said yes, it's important. And that's partly why we started our company, because we wanted to give people choice. The other data point that I wanted to highlight was about who did you talk to when you saw a therapist? So of the people who said they met with a therapist in the past 12 months, here's how the data breaks down into whether they shared that information with a family member, with a friend, or if they kept it quiet. So we found that 19% of our respondents did not tell anybody. We were surprised that about 50% of respondents said they told both family members and friends. And so we're starting to see a change in how people engage with therapy and with their families and with friends. So we see that a lot in just I would say in the public media and the social media, there's more of an openness to therapy and seeking help. But I know there are a lot of messages that we've gathered from childhood that might have prevented some of those people from seeking therapy. So I'm going to pause here and I want to open it up to our panel with our first question, which kind of highlights some of the points that we just shared in the data. What are some messages that you received growing up, or maybe you still receive, about mental health and substance use and addiction? And how is that connected to your identity, culture, and ethnicity? So let's start with April.
Yeah, so my name's April Toy. For those of you who haven't met me, which I think is probably everyone on this call, I'm located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm an attorney, but I am also a recovering alcoholic. I come from a family of alcoholics. Alcoholism runs on both sides. I'm bi-ethnic, so I am half Latina, half Caucasian. And growing up, there was a lot of clash of culture in my house. So for instance, and to this day, for instance, when I finally did tell my family that I had a problem with alcoholism and that I was getting sober, some of the messaging that I got from my father was that the problem wasn't alcoholism, the problem was me, and that I had, quote, Indian blood, and therefore I couldn't handle my alcohol. Which of course, now that I say it out loud, is absolutely, terrifying. And from my mom's side, there was a lot of, we don't talk about these things. and maybe it's not that bad. Maybe she did not want to acknowledge that her daughter would have a problem such as alcoholism. And so I ended up feeling very isolated, even though one would think that in a family who struggles with it, throughout the entire family, I would have some support.
Thank you for sharing that, April. How about Diana?
Yes. So I'm ethnically Chinese. My parents immigrated from China to Austria, which is where I grew up, about 35, 40 years ago. So my parents are very, grew up in the Cultural Revolution, didn't know much about psychology, didn't know anything about nurturing a child, validating feelings, none of that. And I'm sure that some of the attendees can relate, not only a generational, but also a cultural mismatch between what I believe and what my parents believe now. But so essentially growing up, it was never, first of all, nobody asked me about my feelings, right? So feelings weren't even a thing. Feelings, emotions, right? Like no one ever talked about it. No one ever had them. And honestly, to this day, like my parents' emotional well-being, like I don't think they've ever addressed them. So to me, when I came here for college, right, which is pretty far away, and I had to kind of do things on my own, I had to take care of myself on my own, I started seeing a therapist. And things that I would receive, when talking to my parents, when I would share, which wasn't very often because of the things I'm about to share with you, where this person makes money off of you, right? Like they're telling you these things that, and I'm like, I mean, yes, that is correct factually, but also I'm trying to get help, right? And then also things like, so do you like lie on a couch when you like talk to them, right? So, and that's when it really dawned on me, they just had no idea, right? All of the stereotypes, all of the things that people think they know about psychotherapy, they've taken it and they've never really taken an interest into what it actually is in this day and age. And then also in addition to medication, right? So I don't know if anyone can relate, right? But my parents were always like, just go for a run, just drink some tea, just gargle some salt water, right? And those remedies might all be true for a certain physical, like other physical diseases, but it just didn't work with the issues that I was facing. So I was I wasn't super open to taking medication. And I think that's why it took me years to be open to seeing a psychiatrist and taking medication. And since then, honestly, my life has changed 180. But that was kind of, something that was taught to me, and also that I've very much taken inside of me to say, okay, maybe medication I shouldn't be taking. So those were kind of the lessons that were taught to me.
Thank you for sharing that. And, in our data, we've also found there's often lots of messages around shame, silence, judgment. And so you're pulling out some of these messages for sure. I can go to Danya and Mariette. Do you want to jump in to this first question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Donia. I am a first generation Iranian American, and in Iranian culture, there's a term called vasvas, which is kind of like to be particular. So you're telling someone that, growing up around me, adults always joke that some family members had certain different vasvas. They always brought their own bed sheets to hotel rooms, or they would clean a certain way, or things that, became just like a kind of a running joke in the family, but also very lighthearted, like it wasn't a big deal. And I also was raised in the Iranian culture of our house was always spotless. So anytime we had guests over, anytime family came over, top to bottom, house cleaned. So I thought these were normal. And so when I developed what they were terming as vasvas for so many years, and really developed a lot of OCD behaviors around cleaning, it was hard to differentiate and see what was normal to them and what was actually an issue. And when I reached a point in my life that I just couldn't live normally anymore, it was really lonely and it was really isolating. I recall one time I was explaining to my aunt, who I was very close with, I was like, I'm feeling very depressed. And she was like, yeah, but you have a great job in big law, you're healthy. Why are you sad? You know, when I was your age, to get to work, I had to take 4 buses and trains and I had kids. I'm like, there's nothing wrong in your life. Why are you depressed? And even kind of getting answers like telling family members I'm sad or wanting to be happy. I'm like, who's happy? And I think that was kind of really jarring to me. And these situations kind of taught me that my feelings were supposedly normal and shouldn't be seen as anything that needs to draw concern. So when I was still exhibiting major symptoms of OCD and depression, it just made me feel a lot more isolated.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think I'll have everyone introduce themselves because I think there's such a rich conversation that we're having. And I think one of the things that you highlighted is that in some cultures, there is no word or translation for mental health or say depression or anxiety. So I also wanted to lift that up as well. I'll go to Mariette next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mariette Clardy Davis, and I dealt with or really had mental health challenges as an African-American female since the age of 21. I had an official diagnosis of bipolar depression, but how that really played out in my community was silence. I would say the overarching theme was silence. I was taught to be silenced, not consciously, but through unconscious behaviors and actions. So certain examples would be the feeling, I was a part of a church community, United Methodist Church. I had deep roots in the church. Specifically, I think my great-great-grandfather started the church, and my grandmother was really in leadership in the national organization. And so there was a feeling that I had to be that those were the things that were not discussed, and that there was a tinge of embarrassment that those weren't the things that you brought up in a church environment, which, thinking back on it now, that really should be the first place that you're vulnerable. But there was I feel like the church for many Black communities is this community, but it's also an ecosystem in itself. And you have families that go back generations, many years, and it just creates it in its own world, a feeling of where you have to be a certain way and act a certain way because you come from X family. And so a lot of my personal experience with mental health was shaped around that.
Thank you. Thank you. You bring up a great point that we hopefully will get into about kind of faith and spirituality and mental health. So there's a lot of conversation about that in the Black church and some of the Latinx churches as well. Let's go to Alan.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Alan Wong. I'm born and raised based in Boston. My parents immigrated here from Hong Kong 50 years ago. It's kind of crazy to look at the calendar. As I say, 1973. So my sort of perspective is, I'm Chinese American, I'm Asian American at large. I have a more quote unquote American upbringing than a lot of my Asian American friends who were children of immigrants. My parents, for example, never used capital punishment on me. They weren't super strict about my grades. Whereas my wife had the classic tiger mom, if you got a 97 on a test, you got 3 lashings. So to layer on to that, what I view as being very Chinese East Asian culture about like sticking to norms, right? So like mental health challenges are viewed as being different from the norm. Being LGBTQ is being viewed as being different from the norm. The reinforcing message I got from everyone in my family's life and from my cultural background was that anything deviating from the norm was abnormal. And as I've gotten older and I have a couple of young kids myself, I look at the way that I was raised, and even my quote unquote super American parents really fostered those, falsehoods in me. And Dion had mentioned there's this very pervasive rejection almost of quote unquote Western medicine among East Asians, which is very strange because if you look at the population of doctors in the United States, they're overwhelmingly East and South Asian. So is it really Western medicine when the practitioners are for our own people? But that definitely, leads to the difficult conversations people have about getting treatment, where, like my parents didn't even want me to get antibiotics for this sinus infection I had for like a whole month. And it's like, this is mold, right? It's penicillin. It was manufactured years and years ago and it's totally safe. And they're like, oh, I don't know, those pills, those Western doctors with their ideas. Which again begets from my personal experience. I'm like, Western doctors, mom and dad, you guys moved here in like the Carter administration. You guys are American. I don't know what you're talking about. But the cultural impacts on those conversations with my family, definitely, you're talking about not just mental health issues, but the feeling of being different or being imperfect, I think is exacerbated by my culture. So really happy to be here today and talk about those cultural barriers.
Thank you. And we'll turn to Richard.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and a delight to be with you and to share space with this really dynamo group of folks and their tales. Again, my name is Richard Hennessy. I'm a partner at the law firm of Morrison Mahoney here in Boston. I'm part of our firm's wellness committee, and I am a member of the MBA's lawyer well-being committee. And being part of this panel means a great deal to me to the extent I have things to offer. Dovetailing off of what the others have talked about, I can't really argue the fact that my parents are about as Caucasian as you can get. But I from growing up in that environment, I come from an Irish family. My father is one of 9 siblings. A great majority of them have suffered through some phase of alcohol dependence or substance abuse problems, despite successes and challenges in their lives. I'm the youngest of 3 children. I've got a much older sister and brother. So by the time I was a wingnut growing up, my parents had pretty much seen all of it, and their whole approach to me was, just don't get yourself killed or arrested. I had shown pretty good academic promise and athletic success. So their whole goal with me was to basically corral me from causing harm to myself or others. And kind of what some other folks have been talking about growing up, a lot of the response to the emotional aspects of life that we all go through, to say nothing of trying to fill those voids with any variety of substances, was to bury and ignore these kind of feelings. My parents, who have provided me with a lovely upbringing, went through a lot of hard times, when they got married back in, I don't know what, I think they got married in 1963 or something like that. So they got married when they're like 20, and I can't even imagine. I mean, I'm 46. I've got 4 kids, 2 with my ex-wife and 2 with my current partner. I'm like horribly irresponsible at age 46, let alone trying to think about what life would have been, at 20, trying to raise kids. But the long story short of it is that, I was a loose cannon growing up, and I experimented and I did things that put myself and those around me in jeopardy. And, when it was time to sort of talk about that stuff, it really wasn't, God love my mom and dad, and my father's passed away, but it wasn't the sounding board that you'd kind of like to have. And kind of what Alan was saying about his little munchkins, with the 4 kids I have, I always envision, how I can be, the right father for them, co-parent with my ex-wife and our 2 kids, and raise the 2 children I have with my partner down in Hull. And it's a daunting thing to think about, because, we're all a product of our environment. And I just know that there wasn't any reception on in my family side to when I started to experience problems that were coming to the surface, things that I couldn't just white knuckle and get through independently. Or if I did try to do that, it was with disastrous results. So a lot of it came through and we'll talk about other issues throughout this presentation, but a lot of it was like consequence-based response, where there were certain things presented to me based on my actions that I had to make a decision one way or the other on how I wanted to proceed. And like with April, I am a grateful stumbling alcoholic of almost 7 years in recovery. And in addition to every other thing you could put in front of me that I would take. But it's a situation where, like, you know, where's your outlet? Where's your emotional support? And I always found that to be a real challenge. You know, in growing up, nothing was ever really talked about. I don't fault my parents or my, you know, the elders in my family about that. It's just what it was. And now I think the next step is to try to figure out how I can encounter this kind of stuff with my own kids, my colleagues, my friends, and be the best sort of, you know, recipient of that information, listen, provide any advice and counsel that I can with a dose of humor. Because really, you know, my story is no different from probably anybody else's, but it's an absolute train wreck at times, and all you can do is try to giggle after the fact, because we've been able to sort of, you know, grasp and crawl our way out of it. So no, it's one of these things where we're all so very important to ourselves, to the universe, and recognizing that, so that we can make steps that are necessary to help and push through the barriers that you sometimes run into with, like, I can't imagine Danya's kind of background. I mean, as much as the OCD that I have is mostly related to the things that I can control. And one of that is like doing laundry in my basement. And it brings me great joy because most everything else is like this flurry of chaos. But I can have that beautiful piece of folding the clothes, arranging them, only to be absolutely destroyed by my family when I bring them upstairs. But it's these little things that I can't imagine some of the stuff that folks have gone through. But we all have a narrative to tell. And again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys carving out the afternoon with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And we'll wrap it up with David.
Yeah, so happy to be here, and I think so many what other folks have shared have really resonated. So I'm a professor here at Brown. I'm also a psychologist by training, and also queer, first-gen Nicaraguan American that grew up very bicultural. That I think so much of what folks have shared around how alcohol and mental health have been perceived, right, has definitely influenced, I think, one, my own personal life, but also the work that I'm doing today, right? I think oftentimes binge drinking was kind of very much normalized, right? Whether it be at parties or at family gatherings. My aunt has this very sort of common saying of, you know, if I'm only going to have one bottle, I'm not going to drink. While also sort of, I think the other piece that gets highlighted is sort of that piece of stigma that so many different folks were talking about, right? And sort of seeking help, and at least for me, becoming a psychologist, right? My parents were like, what are you going to do and why? Right. I think so many communities of color, and also I think broader communities have this sort of narrative of los trapos sucios se lavan en casa, right? That like your dirty dishes are best washed at home, right? To sort of keep things within the family, right? And sort of going beyond and outside of that is just a wild conception, right? And we actually see that, right? When we look at who gets treatment and how frequently people get treatment, right? So for white folks, for folks who have a substance use disorder across their lifetime, only about 24% folks tend to get treatment. And the number actually tends to be lower for Black and Hispanic folks. So about 18% for Black folks that have, so Black folks, roughly only about 18% that have a substance use disorder receive treatment, and that's lower for Hispanic folks, right? That I think so many of the different things we've been talking about today are really highlighted by those numbers, and even fewer people tend to complete treatment as well.
Thank you. I think it was really important for each of you to share your stories and what brought you here. And I just want to echo again, thank you for being brave to share your stories in this space. I know some of you have done that in other contexts. I'll just quickly share, you know, I grew up in Barbados, and similar to some of you, very, very stigmatized messages about mental health. I remember there's one psychiatric hospital, it's a small island, but I remember driving by there and seeing people who are very severe mental health conditions, they'd be talking to themselves. And I think for most of us, that was our concept of mental health. It was this very severe functioning, that you're so bad that you have to be hospitalized. And I think part of the silence and shame around mental health is that we don't learn what are those milder, earlier signs of mental health, and how do we recognize in ourselves when we might need some more support. So I think when sometimes we have this vision or this image that a person with a mental health condition looks like this very severely incapacitated person, and we don't see that range. And I think I was blessed to have an uncle who's now passed, who had significant substance abuse issues, including cocaine abuse, invited me to be part of his journey once he knew I wanted to be a psychologist, brought me to NA meetings and invited me and shared his story. And so I take those stories, I honor each of your stories that you've told, and there are probably stories in this room that, we want to honor in that space. But with that question, knowing the stigma, and many of you shared some of the stigma, some of the messages you got from family, when you realized that you needed support, how did you make that decision? How was that first step to getting help for you? And I'll start off with, I think for this question, Diana, if you want to tell us, like, what was that first step? Was there a battle with yourself and your family? Tell us a little bit about what that process was for you, and how did you make that step anyway?
Absolutely. So just to give you a little bit more background as well, which ties into the story, is that so ever since I was little, ever since I can remember, I've dealt with suicidal ideation. I don't remember a time when I didn't have that feeling. It was just very cold and dark and sad growing up. And, but somehow I just got through it. And then I was in college and I was still battling it every day, but time went by. And what I know now is that I identify with a lot of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. And all this time, I just thought I had all of these emotions and I wasn't normal. And why was I always that, crazy ex-girlfriend? Like, why would I lash out if I felt like somebody was, not treating me nicely? All of these things. So and I was the things that, you see portrayed in like TV shows and everything, right? Like, for example, and obviously I'm not proud of it, but I'm also seeing it in light of all of this now makes sense of, for example, if threatening to hurt yourself when somebody's trying to leave you, right? All of these things. So I didn't really seek out, I went to BC for undergrad, and I kind of came back from studying abroad, and I didn't really know. I was just like, this is too much. Like, I don't know what to do, but this is too much. And the counseling services they offer, like, do you need like a place to just like get away? And my home was across the ocean. So away was McLean Hospital. So that was my first hospitalization. And to this day, I don't know, would you consider that me getting help or, it was some coordination. And that was the first time that I told my parents that I was in there. And, based on what I was saying prior, they were like, you need to get out of there as soon as possible. Like, what can we do? And skip forward a few years, nothing really changed. I didn't start medication. I didn't start seeing a therapist regularly. But then fast forward a few years and I'm kind of in that situation again, right? Like, I felt like somebody was leaving me, abandonment issues were flaming up, and my friends were worried, right? They asked the doorman to come into my apartment and they saw a note. I was actually at a yoga class, but they were like, we're not leaving until we see you in the ER room. And so that's kind of how I got help. I don't know if I necessarily saw it's interesting, right? Because with my disorder, it's like the seeking help was in a very different way, right? Like, my seeking help was telling my friends, I think I'm going to hurt myself. I don't want to wake up tomorrow, XYZ. So that's kind of how it happened for me. And lucky enough for me, like my friends understand and understood, and we're very close now too. And they saw it as me asking them for help.
Thank you. And I think that sometimes in that getting help, and I really appreciate you sharing, like, it wasn't necessarily I'm saying I'm gonna go call a therapist and get that more of a traditional way, but in the way that maybe made sense for you. And you were also received it, right? Because there are times where, I've worked with high school students and I've worked with college students where that journey can take some time, right? There may be a few attempts before the person really kind of comes to an acknowledgement that what they're dealing with is maybe more lifelong than they anticipated. How about for you, Mariette? What was kind of maybe the precipitating event, or what was the thing that helped and really kind of turned the corner for you
So
in support?
my perspective is really interesting because I was always a seeker of solutions. I know many lawyers can probably resonate with that. I always wanted to find out what was the answer. How do I fix this with myself? And so I did what I call all the things. I actually did medication. I did therapy. I did exercise. I was engaged in the community. But despite all of that, the cycles continued and I wasn't feeling better. Things weren't getting better. And so my biggest challenge was, well, society is telling me to do all of these things, or at least that was my perception, and I am doing them, but yet I'm not feeling, I still feel like I'm in survival mode all of the time, and my symptoms of depression continued. And so the pivotal point was really, I was at a client meeting. Actually, I was going to visit a client in Miami. I was in a hotel room and I said to myself, I just cannot do this anymore. I literally will either, go one direction and keep moving forward there, or I need to get help. And I called the number to my therapist. I remember the therapist I had at the time and said, I'm at a crossroads, but I just cannot continue to do this because logically I can't understand why I'm doing all of these things, but yet I feel like I am drowning. And so that was the pivotal point where I walked myself into a treatment behavioral health center, sat down, and I said I needed help. And even though I was there, however, I got help, but I was still in that mindset, that feeling that I just couldn't let go. And so I went in for a week and a half. I had another terrible break and I was back in for a month, where then I was able to make real change. But that pivotal moment was the crossroads, because as someone who is always looking at what is the solution to a problem, I just couldn't, I felt like it was there. And for decades, I just couldn't get to it.
Thank you. Another important perspective. And again, that journey may not be a one-time thing. And so for the folks listening in, please, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A button or the chat. We will look at those. We will leave some time at the end. But I, want you to reflect on whether these stories are resonating with an experience you're having for yourself, or even a coworker or a family member, right? I think sometimes in these conversations, as Diana shared, right, sometimes it's the friends who can help get someone to support. April, I'd love to hear from you on this question as well.
Yeah, so wow, I mean, I guess the question is so loaded for me. As I mentioned, I grew up in a family of alcoholics. My father still drinks a lot, and he drank in a way that no one ever talked about alcoholism in my house. In fact, I didn't even know that my father was potentially an alcoholic, because you can only self-diagnose, so I can't exactly diagnose him as an alcoholic, but I did see him drink every day. I saw him drink only at 9 o'clock. He'd drink before he went to bed. He'd get intoxicated. never was abusive, never was mean, never operated under the influence of alcohol, got up, went to work the next day, never drank at work. It was, very regimented. And surprisingly, I didn't think that he was an alcoholic. In fact, I didn't really put two and two together until I was in high school. And I had been seeing this growing up because we're all told that alcohol is legal and only people with problems become addicted. And so I leave the house, I go through my life, and I don't really start drinking until I'm in law school. Shockingly, I start drinking exactly like my father. I start drinking in law school. I drink throughout my career. I am successful. I'm killing it. I have a marriage that's healthy. I don't get drunk in public. I don't break any laws. I'm rising in my profession. In fact, I'm an outstanding person in my profession. I'm getting all these leadership positions and I'm getting very good at my craft. And so this stigma of an alcoholic, this idea of what an alcoholic is that I have in my head, actually prevented me from seeking help, because I'm thinking this is a person who does all of these things. Yet inside, I was dying. I was drinking every day, just like my dad. I only started at like 9 o'clock at night, and I'd drink like a bottle of wine every night, sometimes a bottle and a half, more on weekends. And I'd go to sleep, and then I'd wake up and do it all over. So it's just this cycle. It's just my normal at this point. And so I'm looking around at all of my friends, and nobody drinks like me. My husband doesn't think anything of it. In fact, when I first started kind of researching what alcoholism is, because this became something that was very terribly distressing to me, because I knew inside that my mental health was being destroyed. I also suffer from anxiety, and I wanted nothing more than to stop. Every night I would go to bed and I'd say, I'm not going to have another drink. And every morning I'd wake up and I'd be very committed to not drinking again. And by the time the evening rolled around, there was nothing that was going to stop me from taking a drink. And it became this vicious cycle. And so I started reading books, book after book after book after book on alcoholism, reading books on the neuroscience behind what happens in your brain when you drink alcohol, what happens in your brain to get addicted. I'd read memoirs, tons of memoirs, especially by high functioning women who also struggled with alcoholism. And I started to realize that no, there's not just one alcoholic. We come across the whole spectrum. They're very different, but there are a lot of alcoholics who are just like me. There are people who want nothing more than to stop drinking, but just cannot do it. And so for about 2 years, I just devour books. I must have read like 60 books of all different sorts, just on the subject of alcoholism. And the stigma of alcoholism, I didn't want to be grouped in with the people that I thought were, I didn't want people to think, we can't trust her with our files if she goes and seeks help, right? We can't trust her and promote her to partner if she goes and seeks help and admits that she has this problem, because alcoholics are this and I saw myself as that. And I do apologize for, setting up that dichotomy, because obviously like there's a whole wide range of alcoholics everywhere in between. But I refused to go into rehab, absolutely refused. And so I went through the cycle, stop and start for 2 years, stop and start, read books, learn about it. Refused to go to AA because they didn't want anybody to see me at a meeting. What if somebody saw me going to a church? Well, what were you doing there? And Milwaukee's a small town. Not a small town, but it's a small city, I should say. And so I didn't get help when I probably should have. Finally, I had an embarrassing situation, and I won't go into the details of it. But I realized that I needed something more. And so that night, the first night back after the weekend, I went to my first AA meeting. And I walked in, And there was something magical. I didn't even tell my husband I was going. He had a board meeting for something. And there was something magical that happened in that room. There was something magical about standing up in front of a group of people and just saying, you know, my name is April and I'm an alcoholic. And as soon as those were the only 2 words I said the whole meeting, because I started crying right there. And I will never forget the boots that I had on, because I just stared at my boots and cried the whole evening. And it was this turning point. And I made friends and they encouraged me. And, you know, despite 2 years of trying, it was that one meeting that was the final thing that gave me the strength. It took me across the finish line. And that was the very last night that I had a drink, was my first night of AA.
Thank you, April. And again, I really just appreciate you sharing your stories, and I know that people who are listening are really taking in what you're saying. I think I wanted to just highlight this idea, and maybe David, you can jump in on this with me. This idea of high functioning, right? You've heard this, you mentioned this, April. Other people talked about being able to kind of function during the day, but then at night they're falling apart. We saw that come up a lot recently in when Chelsea Chris died by suicide. There's a lot of this narrative about her having high functioning depression and anxiety. And so while it's not an official diagnosis, I'd love, David, if you can lend a little bit of comment about when someone is saying it's high functioning, whatever after that, right? Anxiety, depression, whatever the mental health condition, what are the people actually saying? What does that actually mean?
What was that last part, Charmaine? What are
I
people?
said, what does it actually mean
Yeah.
when we say high functioning anything
Yeah, so
related to mental health?
yeah, so I think these are folks, right, that have gotten really good at coping, right? And I think oftentimes like law school isn't easy, right? So like you've been high functioning in law school, so I'm sure most folks are high functioning people, right? Navigating the world as a person of color, right? You're high functioning within that regard. So I think there are sort of these adaptive skills, right, that might get sort of translated into other areas of our life that then might sort of obfuscate some of the problems that are actually present, right? That I think oftentimes what we see is that folks tend, right, like is that folks are able to manage and sort of be at bay with their symptoms. Yet we see that there is sort of this point where folks do need sort of help, right? And so I think what April touched upon was also really powerful, is the role that community plays in support as well, right? And I think oftentimes we have this image of what a person with alcohol use disorder looks like, right? As sort of likely this might be this more extreme version of somebody, right, that might be sort of drinking and driving and sort of constantly sort of in out of the criminal system, et cetera, right? But knowing that this looks very differently for everybody. And I think where things get kind of murky, right, is that for the actual criteria of alcohol use disorder, it's impairment in daily life functioning, right? But when we might not see this impairment in daily life functioning, that's where folks might sort of get like, oh, like nothing's wrong with me, I'm okay because I'm functioning, right? I am showing up to work, I still have relationships, but odds are is that some of these things sort of might start to sort of deteriorate over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other point, people often talk about being able to hold it together for a certain period of time. Like maybe you get through that day, maybe that last hour might be struggle, but it's that wearing of the mask. And I think the point you talked about in terms of sometimes in very high pressure positions, high pressure jobs, where you're also people who are maybe, I've ventured to say, kind of high achieving as well. And the idea of asking for help for someone who is educated can feel really hard. It's like, well, I know what I'm doing. Like, why? and that asking for help sometimes is seen as a sign of weakness. So we're kind of battling our cultural ideas, and then there's ideas about who we are and asking for help. What does that look like? So just again, thinking about how this might show up for folks in their day-to-day life when they're in these situations. I want to, as we're looking to kind of shift the conversation a bit, I'd love to talk a little bit about how was it finding support. One of the things we have, and I'll share those resources about, for particularly, we're talking about therapy, we're talking about recovery, AA. I think it's great that we're mentioning different types of resources, and we want you to know there are many, many options out there. And so how do we ensure that people also recognize that there's not just one solution? So I'd open it up. I don't know if Danya or Mariette, you want to talk about just some of the options you explored, and what was that? Was it important? I think I shared the data, 88% of people want a therapist that looks like, similar cultural background. What was important to you in finding that support, and how hard or how easy was it to find the resource that helped you the most?
Dr. Jackman, something you mentioned I think was really key is that there are so many different support systems, and there's more than one. It's not just going to a therapist and I think what all of these support systems have in common, at least for me personally, is like I was really looking for a no judgment zone. Absolutely zero judgment. And that's hard to find when it's someone who really cares about you, wants you to do well, or has your best interest. Sometimes doesn't mean your best interest in the way that maybe you define it. And I think that was something that was very hard for me. I'm very close with my mom. I'm very close with my family. So having a disconnect when I was going through my severe OCD and depression was really difficult. And I found that having people be honest and talk about what they were going through in various ways, I know has really, throughout the COVID pandemic, has become much more accessible and is much more talked about, has really kind of been the turning point. And it was for me. I was in my first year of practicing law when we went into the pandemic, and was attending an event and just a speaker panel such as this, where someone was speaking about their experience, high functioning attorney with OCD and depression. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that. Like, I am not alone. This is so interesting. This is so mind blowing. And it really just, like, seeing other people live through it made me realize that it was okay to reach out for support. And then taking the education that I got from my therapist about what my diagnosis was, how my symptoms kind of play out, and taking it back to my mom and back to my brother and educating them back and saying, you want to learn how to help me, and I know so badly you want to help me and you don't know how. I also didn't know how, but I'm learning, and let me teach you too. And I think that support system kind of goes both ways. In addition to just also having my brother always just let me have space. Like, if I needed to cry and just like be in my mood that I was in, he would just sit there and like let it happen, didn't let me feel anything bad about it, didn't make me, ask me why I was doing something or make a comment. And I think that was really special as well.
Excellent, thank you. I want to also, the piece I wanted to bring in now is around, so many of you have talked about taking a leave of absence or being hospitalized. We didn't necessarily didn't say leave of absence, but if you're taking time away from work or time away from school, usually that requires some kind of medical letter, so that people know you're returning, and kind of hold your space in school, hold your space at work, right? We know that there are laws around that. If you have a mental health or substance use condition, the ADA has laws around protecting your rights around that. So I'd love to hear for you, particularly, again, we may have people in the audience who are contemplating getting support. And what does that look like to go out and come back, right? Were there supports in place? How did you have that conversation with your school or with your whoever your supervisor was? How did those conversations go? And, you know, if they didn't go well, what do you wish would have been different in those conversations? And let me see who was going to share that. Let's see. I think I have April or Richard, if you want to jump in.
Love to jump in on that topic. Alas, I've never done it. And what I would suggest is that if the circumstances make sense to the individual, absolutely take advantage of that time to find the space you need, the resources, and the time to heal and figure out. And I'll let April jump on to this if she's got more to offer, but just, one of the things I think it all comes down to, like, even back to the stigma thing, is like crickety, like, am I gonna, it's one thing to sort of put ourselves face forward as representatives of the issues that a majority of the population experiences, but it's another step to sort of, take a further proactive step to back away from the things that cause you distress. And it's just baby steps at a time. Like, it was a big deal when I started here at Morrison Mahoney. I had, I'm always a work in progress, but I'd become sober. I had found stability in my life and my, all the relationships that I had to some degree. And it was incremental, actually it was the when COVID hit us all, it was me reaching out to some of the senior folk at the firm, offering any support for my colleagues who may be having, issues with substances or what have you. And that was like my sort of first step to sort of inject myself into it. But yeah, I mean, if I had if I could have done it over again, instead of getting fired from jobs or just absolutely blowing up my life, maybe it would have been a good idea to just pull the ripcord and find something. But maybe somebody else has more relevant experience.
So, like Richard, I never took time off work, and I think that was a mistake. I think that I would have quit much earlier had I felt comfortable and confident that taking time off and going into rehab would not have hurt me from a professional standpoint. I did not know that there were protections for people. I did not know anyone who in my profession who had struggled with this, frankly. And so I was so overwhelmed with shame and fear that somebody might find out that there was something wrong with me, that I did not go and seek out help. And so, I mentioned that I spent 2 years stopping and starting. It was almost like a weekly cycle. I'd stop one day and then I might take a day or two off and then I'd start again. And, especially when you're talking about something like substance abuse, there's a few different things that are going on. Number one, your body is physically addicted. And number two, your mind is addicted. And that physical addiction, man, is it hard to drop. I mean, my first week of not drinking, I had never gone a full week without drinking. And like, I started drinking and I almost became a daily drinker right away. And from like when I started drinking through 10 years, I had never gone a week without drinking. That first week was really hard. I could not think. It was so bad. And the truth is I should not have been going to work and pushing through that. I should have been focusing on my recovery and healing and been in a space where I would have support. But I am who I am and I got to do things my own way. And so, I just muscled through and did it. But, I think if anyone is out there, knows anybody who's struggling, have them reach out to whatever your lawyer assistance program is, or some other avenue. I know in Wisconsin we have one. I know you all who we're putting on the this program are part of a lawyer's assistance program. So
yeah, thank you. And we will be sharing resources. Amy will share some resources. Mariette, you said you can share some perspective on this topic, so please jump in. Thank you.
Yes, so I actually did take first 2 weeks off, and then it didn't help, and I took over a month off. So number one, I took short-term disability, and what that means was I maxed out my vacation time, and then I took short-term disability to basically do intensive outpatient treatment, which is you being in the hospital and then you go home and then you come back. So my return back to work was honestly messy, but I think looking back on it, I was just in a place of complete vulnerability and fragility, because I had gone into what I call a fishbowl and really just intensively tried to do the work. And now I'm moving from that back into the world. And so it was messy, it was jarring. And I just want to be completely honest, because I didn't have that kind of pathway where it's like, okay, I'm going to work my way back. It was 0 to 100 real quick. And one of the things that I think was important for me was I understood that things had to change, and I knew that I needed to create wraparound solutions. So what did that look like? I went through kind of more of an informal accommodation process, which is a process where you work with your employer to get modifications to your work environment to help you. We had the doctor's information, and everyone knew by that point that that was what I needed to grow and to do the work that I needed to do. So I had accommodations. I continued with intensive therapy and did intensive work through a therapist, medication management, but much more pointed therapy versus just going once a week. I went to therapy at that point 3 times a week. Also, in addition to the accommodations, it was really looking at everything from what I was eating, challenging different beliefs and things that I was telling myself, and then finally looking at different coping tools and skills that I was learning. And I distinctly remember doing things like putting Post-it notes on my cube at work. And whenever things would come up, looking, because again, I had just learned these tools like 3 weeks ago, and running into the bathroom and doing these coping skills. And so it is, for me, it was very messy, but it was an evolution, and it was necessary to get to that point.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's so important. And I know April mentioned some resources, you mentioned some. So, most companies, and I venture to say probably all law firms, will have some type of employee assistance program that have therapists that are available free of cost, or at least their portion of that that's available for free. Many people have folks like Richard in a role where there's a wellness person, and they're often also peer support. So there are definitely many avenues to get support. And I know Amy will be posting some of those links and resources as well. Amy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to
Just like for
mention that.
lawyers helping lawyers,
Yes,
Yes,
lawyers for lawyers, exactly. And so if people do go to our website, lclma.org, we have a list of resources, but also you can schedule. So we are considered a lawyer's assistance program, which every state has their own. We're for Massachusetts. And you can schedule a private and confidential free consultation. We have 4 clinicians on staff. And again, it's just going to our website and setting up an appointment with them. But I will, again, share some additional resources, but I wanted to jump in and say, yes, Massachusetts the legal community, we have something right here.
Absolutely. And I think that we're seeing a lot of shifts in that return to work. We're actually working with companies about how do we set a strategy to support people to come back. that they're not coming back and expected to perform their full load, because it's really impossible to do that. April, you talked about that. Marriott, you talked about that. Coming back after being out for some support and then jumping right back in, you're still healing. You're still in this healing process. So, you know, companies that are really responsive and attending to the mental health and well-being of their employees are looking for creative and innovative ways to support people as they come back. So I'll do one more round of questions and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So people post your questions in. We want to hear you. We want to hear what's resonated with you. So my last question here is, I think I want to combine a couple questions. Many of you have mentioned the importance of support and having a support system as part of your recovery and your healing process. Talk a little bit about that and how, you know, how getting support, how shifted maybe the internalized stigma you had around seeking mental health. How has that shifted for you? How you think about mental health and well-being now? So think about your support system and then shifts in your own thinking about mental health that have been destigmatized, going through your own personal process for our family. I know, Alan, you've talked about family. So I would just open it up. Whoever on mics first, you go ahead and do it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll do a quick plug. I mean, Deanna and I know each other because we're both on the board members of the Asian American Lawyers Association of Massachusetts. The panelists have heard me complain about that bad acronym. Sorry to the people who came up with it 30 years ago. I think, you know, being first generation, my parents didn't get the opportunity to have formal education like I did. And I come from this culture where, like, you know, you never complain. And there's this whole concept I learned in college from one of my really, really favorite professors who talked about how, like, if you're an immigrant in America, there's this like perception that you're supposed to be like eternally grateful for your opportunities. So it's like you're constantly faced with this idea of like, not only are you supposed to be perfect, but like, you know, why complain about your suffering when your parents went through so much more? Being part of the affinity bar has been really huge for me. And I would say it's my network. I come from a super small family, right? My parents fled the communists, so they're only children. I don't have any cousins. I have an older brother that I have like nothing in common with, who is not a lawyer. I think having other lawyers who just get it, and for me, being that person for other people now is like a really big part of my identity and what I feel is really important to be a support network. The APALSAs, the Asian Pacific American Law Student Associations, and all the Boston schools had their annual event a couple weekends ago, which I attended. And it was really refreshing just to, you know, see how I think even in the last 10, 15 years when I was in law school, how far I can say kids because I'm in my 30s. They really look like kids to me. These like 21-year-old law students have come in terms of supporting one another. And I think having those networks within affinity bars, within regions is really important because you can have that within your own law firm. But what I found is that it's always kind of awkward and there's another extra barrier to being open with people who you are in putative competition with for things like partnership. So I would encourage anybody who's reticent to do things like formal therapy. You know, maybe that's a bridge too far for you, but definitely I would say keep in contact with your friends, your networks, people who just understand you. I think that really goes a long way.
And
Yeah,
Dr.
Alan.
Johnson. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll be brief. Famous last words, but no, Alan nailed it. Is that really, you know, at the end of the day, we all have something that is a boulder in front of our forward progress, you know, and to use another goofy term, I created scenarios over and over again where I was this constant barnacle on like the ship of progress. And I found, you know, a lot of the issues that we deal with, another goofy term, imposter syndrome, where you don't really like even today, I had a funky deposition where I was like, I am way over my skis on this, but you just sort of figure it out and have confidence in yourself. But what Alan's point about, even if finding a therapist isn't in your wheelhouse at this time or what have you, it's your friends, it's the people that love you. Even like I think once I straightened my act out and did the things that I needed to do to, you know, remove the conditions of probation imposed upon me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the state of Vermont. There was a point in time where my mom was like, oh, okay, good boy, like that. And then there was a dialogue that was created there where you could talk about these kind of things. But it's having faith in the ones that love you, and those that you love, and that you should be able to find a safe harbor in that. And that, I spent so much of my times of crisis alone and wanting to ignore this stuff and wanting to just deal with what society has imposed upon me by just getting through it and shutting up. And I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, because there were many nights where I would do whatever I needed to do to quiet the demons, and then I'd take a long swim on the beach and pray for a cramp in my thigh that would just cause me to go to the bottom of the ocean. So yes, any network is a good network. They can have a bunch of letters after their names. They can just be your pal. Like with April, I've attended more AA meetings than I could possibly imagine over the past 7 years. I have a lovely sponsor. It's the people you don't even think are the ones that will get you through. My boss, the friends at work who still think I'm a goofball, and that, what do you mean you don't drink? I was like, well, I'm still a wacko, don't worry about it. It's that kind of stuff, and just very small incremental steps, and using the free help that we can get in this universe. Your trade organizations, Amy and her crew. Every state has a Lawyers Helping Lawyers and Employee Assistance Program. Getting through that threshold of seeking professional help, fantastic. But you don't have to feel even worse if you don't do that. It's out there. You'll just get there. So that's it. Love. Try to find love.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that idea of having to suffer alone, and hopefully we've heard from people here today that there are lots of different resources out there. But I know that when you are and you're in the midst of a crisis, you're in the midst of mental health condition, people often share feeling like no one understands them, no one gets them, nobody wants to be bothered with them, nobody cares, right? There are sometimes these messages that we have, and just know that those messages are part of the mental health condition, and it's really hard, but trying to resist those. I think someone else was going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just gonna speak a little bit about kind of what you were saying, Dr. Jackman, about feeling that loneliness, and that, like, I think you're battling so many things. And someone once told me when I was working at the firm, fake it till you make it. No one knows what they're doing. No one is out there just like this ideal image you have of a person who wakes up and does all the right things and does everything well and like works so hard and like has so much energy and is so happy. That person doesn't exist anywhere. And I think that's what society has taught us to strive for, whether it's your culture, whether as being a female attorney, whatever it is. I think fighting against that is one of the biggest challenges. And it's hard. It's not easy. It's really, really hard. It takes work every day. And I think just like give yourself that grace. Be kind to yourself. As my therapist always tells me, be kind to yourself. You're working so hard, and just like take every day as a day. You're a human being trying your best. And I think that's a really important message.
We have one question in the chat. Oh, I was going to say there's one question in the chat which I want to get to, but I think the other thing I wanted to just raise, and maybe one of you can speak to this. Sometimes, as I think the other people, I want to underscore that sometimes also being the only person of color, few people of color, it can feel very hard to go and say, I need support, right? Because sometimes we're feeling that we have to hold the line for the stereotypes against our particular group. So I know people want to comment to that as well. Dinah, you're talking about, are you muted?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, especially because I don't know who knows about borderline personality disorder, but it's like this type of thing where I really felt like I didn't get support from anybody, right? Anybody, family, friends. And these were the people who were sitting for hours with me, you know, in the ER room at MGH watching Shark Tank for 8 hours. I'm not kidding you, right? But I didn't feel like I could get their support, right? So even if they were saying encouraging words, even though they might be there physically, I wasn't feeling the support. So especially if anybody's listening, like I just remember that feeling so clearly. And so it's really hard because I confided in plenty of people, and I had plenty of people saying, let me know if you need anything, just call me, just let me know. And I would call them and I would text them, but it didn't help, right? So I just want to acknowledge that it can be a very, very hopeless situation for some people, depending on your circumstances and whatever it is that you may be going through. And sorry, I kind of just wanted to mention that. So and just for me, how it helped support is just like I just had to, you know, the only support I felt like I truly received internally was from romantic partners. And I wasn't ready to feel the support by anybody else unless I was working through the things with my therapist. So it is very unfortunate that, you know, like that I couldn't receive it in any other way, but I just want to highlight that unfortunately that can be a symptom of the disease sometimes.
Thank you. So I'll jump to the question because I want to honor the folks. So first question is suggestions for referring clients to therapists with singular language and our cultural, or sorry, similar. I need to get some glasses here. Similar language and our cultural background. So I would definitely say so. innopsych.com is a resource that I created as a directory, as a national database that features therapists of color. So you can look by their ethnic background, you can look by language. And then there are also lots of, it's so funny, when I started the directory in 2020, when we launched, there were not many people as we were developing, but once we launched, there were a bunch of different directories. So there is definitely some, and maybe Amy, we can send an email out to folks, but I know there's some for Asian American, there's Mediterranean, I mean, there's something for everyone out there, Latinx. So there are lots of directories out there that we can definitely add to that resource list.
I will do that after this is over, and also just for everybody to know, it is recorded, so you can go back to our website, lclma.org, and listen to it, but we'll also include and send out some resources.
Great. The second question is, do you have any advice for starting a conversation with someone you're concerned about? Oh, I love that question. So how do you open up that conversation with somebody you're concerned about their behavior, and you want them to get some support?
I can jump on that one briefly. I've been
I'm going to cut you off if you go beyond brief, then, Richard.
Super brief. Yeah, no, it's tough. I've been the receiving end of many of those conversations, and it's not an easy thing to swallow, because who in their right mind has the nerve to question what I do? But I think it's valuable because it resonates, even if not at the time. It's something in the back of your head that even your pals, colleagues who you think are more irresponsible and crazy than you are actually sitting you down, you know, as if you would tell Keith Richards, you know, to lay off, you know, just insane. But it's helped me do the very same thing to folks, not necessarily trying to pick a scab with somebody, but finding it organically. Folks have come in and talked to me about stuff and spitball things, and it's amazing what that conversation can be like. So I highly encourage everybody to receive and give in that regard.
Alan?
I think Deanna said something earlier that resonated with me, right? So I am notoriously like the most direct, blunt person you'll ever meet. And like, I know my impact on different people. Like I have introverted friends where like in the middle of a conversation, I'll just be like, oh, I'm exhausting you. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to leave so we can like preserve our friendship. And it's not weird in that way, right? So I think the most you can do to support your friends is to know who you are to them. And my friends always know, like I almost went an entire webinar about using a sports metaphor, but for me, it's like fastball down the middle, right? Like I am concerned about you. I am here for you. 100-mile-an-hour heater down the middle, hit it if you can. And it's important for me to not be like the honest cat and continue to reappear in the picture of people who might need some space. But it's really important to me as a friend, and I view it as part of my role to just be like, make that one appearance once to be like, meow, here I am. If you need anything, you know, I'm your guy. But to not press any further than that. And I, you know, the same thing, you know, when I hear from friends who are more introverted or very hesitant to talk, when they say, you know, like they reach out just to see how I'm doing, it means a lot to me, right? Like they might not necessarily be in a position to help me in the way that's helpful for me. But it means a lot just to know that you have that support network and people who care about you.
And I can add to that, I'm also a member, Alan, of the Direct Persons Anonymous, however many letters. But one of the things that I found that's been really helpful, and I kind of think about it now, it's funny, but it really wasn't. I would always ask people, how are you doing? And you're going to get the surface level answer. But I would always follow up with, how are you really doing? And then I would just shut up. And two things would happen. Number one, it would help them like, oh, she's actually really asking me how I'm doing. And my uncomfortable silence gave them that space to just speak. And so I think for me, that's the big thing, is really giving people that what you think is uncomfortable silence for some people is safety, because we're often so used to reacting and fixing, you know, problem solving, that we don't take the time to just give people space to say whatever it is. And so those were, you know, that's kind of what I personally use. But I would say the biggest piece of advice is just to ask people how they're doing, and then be open to just listen. And if you, another thing I think that also helps is if you are, many people like shared connection. So if I tell people and I'm vulnerable about how I'm doing, it gives people that space to feel like, okay, she's going to understand when I start speaking and I'm also struggling. So, you know, if you feel comfortable having that vulnerability, I think it also helps to open things up.
I think that's excellent. You know, sharing your story. I think some of you said that if you share your story with people, it allows them, and they may not come to you right away, but they will hear and remember. And I also will say sharing your concern and being specific. Not saying you need to get help, but saying, I am really concerned when I see and name the behavior. I'm worried about your safety. I care about you, right? And so being as specific. And sometimes I don't know if you haven't mentioned it, but sometimes people get mad at you for calling out, for naming that stuff, because they're not ready yet. And I always tell people, like, try not to take it personally. They ghost you, you know, still call, still text, still send a, I'm here, right? Because otherwise it plays into that, they don't care about me, right? There's that way of pushing people away to prove that nobody cares. And so the more that you can stay connected, and like Alan, you know, you kind of pop in like Deanna's cat, that pop in. I'm not going away, I'm going to come back, right? And I think that is really important, because people often will have the message and do the what do you call that? Where the fulfilling prophecy, where they push people away to prove that people don't care. And so fighting that can be hard, because sometimes it can be really challenging when people don't want to get help. They can be nasty around that. But if you can locate that in, this person is really suffering, and I want to be there for them when they're ready.
And I think that's a really excellent point, Dr. Jackman. You know, no one really knew that I had a problem except for my husband. And, you know, he would bring it up from time to time. We had, you know, I'll be honest, we had several fights over it. And I remember that it made me feel alone, because he was asking me to stop something that I desperately wanted to stop. So I think it's important that if you do raise it to somebody, understand that it's probably not going to change them overnight. This person probably wants to get help, or if it's a substance abuse issue, they want to stop more than you know. But, you know, stick it out there with them, because, you know, when I finally did quit and it finally did take, my husband was the, you know, I didn't do anything for 3 months. He did the laundry, he took out the dogs. All I did was focus on my recovery and come home, sit on the couch, and he'd bring me like food and drink. And he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, I don't understand what you're going through. And I don't understand why you feel the need to drink the way that you do, but I'm going to do everything in my power to help you. And that was so important.
Thank you. And I think we have one person wants to say just something that you want to share to the folks out there. Like April, thank you for sharing that experience. Something that might connect with someone who they're at this point where they're thinking, I do want some help, but I don't know if I can take that first step. What is something you might say to give comfort, reassurance?
We touched on this. Oh no, Tiana, you.
No, go
please.
ahead.
We're in a deferral war. I'll talk and then I'll try to leave some time for you. I'll say in the way that we talked earlier about how Richard and I touched on this, like people might not be in a position to feel like they're comfortable going to a therapist or a psychologist. In the same way, in that vein, I would say, I'm thinking a lot about my specifically like cishet guy friends who will like never go to therapy, right? And you like, if I do that approach where I'm like, hey, I'm worried about you, you're gonna get that anger response like Dr. Jackman talked about. And it's like, well, fine, okay, let's, I don't know, go watch football and lift weights and eat red meat or whatever helps you feel comfortable, being around me. Like that's a way to support your friends too, right? It touches on a lot of problematic cultural issues that I think people should go to therapy for. But I've been that person for my friends too. And I would encourage you, if you're concerned about someone, genuinely, it's about supporting them, right? So do what you can in the way that April mentioned about her husband. Like, you might not understand them, or you might feel like there might be more effective ways for them to go about addressing whatever they need to address. But the most you can be is a supportive person to them. So that's my quick piece. I left Diana 90 seconds, I think.
I don't know. I guess when you were posing the question, what I was just thinking about is that, right, I do think that deep down, we as humans, we want to connect, right? All of us want to connect. That's why some people are asking, how are you really doing, Maria? Right? Like, and sure, not everyone is. Maybe some people are going through the stuff, but maybe like give other people the chance to, be that person for you, right? Because again, right, like they probably want to connect, they want to help out, and I'm sure they'll feel honored that you feel like they're a person that you can confide in, right? And I'm sure everyone on this call, right, like we all care, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you're dealing with. I don't know. I don't know if that gives you some hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. I knew we would not run out of things to say, and clearly we could have done this for another hour and a half. Thank you all for listening in. We hope that you've heard something today that can support you on your journey and or a colleague or family member or friend. I'll turn it back over to Amy. Thank you all for our panelists. You were amazing. Again, thank you for sharing your stories, because your stories help to heal others.
And I echo that. Thank you all so much for being so vulnerable and open and willing to share your story. I think that is what's so important at LCL when we're trying to fight this stigma and encourage people to reach out to help. I think one of the biggest ways is to hear other people talking about it, what they went through. A couple of themes is that you're not alone. That's such an important piece. I want to reemphasize that, and that reaching out to support, and that's okay. And what was interesting is I think we did hear from people, and there were a variety of ways of reaching out for support, whether it was April going to an AA meeting or somebody else going to a therapist or going inpatient, going to the emergency room. And then I just want to also emphasize that you can call 988. That is specifically for suicide and crisis. They're available 24 hours, 7 days a week. You can reach out if you need any emotional support. So that's an important and easy number, hopefully, to remember, 988. And then also, thank you so much, Dr. Jackman, for moderating. This was amazing. I appreciate all the information that you shared as well, and very important. And, again, thank you all for doing such a wonderful job and being here with us. I think that, I'm sure it made a difference in somebody's life out there. So thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Much love, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.